Today we're making some dovetails, some mistakes, and a cool mechanism. All to make one of the most beautiful pieces I've ever made. My partner's birthday is coming up. Well, to be precise, it's already passed by the time you're watching this. Anyways, so she recently started sewing and all her stuff is just laying around everywhere. So I wanted to get her a box where she can store all her sewing supplies. When looking into it, I saw boxes with a really cool opening mechanism. So I had to ask myself, do I just buy one for like 60 bucks? Or do I spend 150 bucks in material and 2 weeks of my time to make my own? Well, I obviously chose to make it myself, and since I'm making it as a birthday present, I may as well make it extra fancy. I went to my local lumber yard and got this board of white oak, which is just about wide enough so I can have continuous grain across the box. If I bought this box from a store, they wouldn't care about having continuous grain. They wouldn't care about making it all out of the same board, so the color matches. They just take whatever sheet material they can get their hands on for as cheap as possible and make a box. Well, they would probably make a bunch of boxes. They're probably making thousands. And I'm just making the one as a present. So I get to concentrate more on the little details that will make this box something special. With all the pieces cut to size, it's time to mark the boxes so I know what goes where later. I'm making 5 boxes in total, with the bottom one taller than the others. But once I cut out the legs, they'll all appear to be the same height. Now that the sides are marked, I can sand the faces of the boards. By clamping them all together, it makes it a lot quicker and easier as it prevents me from accidentally rounding over the edges as I sand. Dovetails are arguably one of the most recognizable joints in all of woodworking. Even if you're not into woodworking, you've probably seen them before. Whether in antique furniture or high quality wooden boxes, there's a reason they're so iconic. Not only are dovetails incredibly strong and reliable, but they also highlight the beauty of woodworking. The interlocking design does more than just hold the pieces together. It shows the care, skill and attention to detail that went into making it. When you see dovetails in a piece, you know someone took the time to create something truly special. They're a beautiful blend of form and function, making them the perfect choice for a project like this. Crafting dovetails involves a lot of repetitive tasks: measuring, marking, cutting, and chiseling. There's something deeply satisfying about cutting the first set of dovetails. The way the pieces lock together perfectly, it's a moment that feels really rewarding. But after 2 full days of cutting dovetails for all 5 boxes, I'll admit, the charm started to wear off. What began as a relaxing process started to feel more like a chore. When it comes to making dovetails, there's more than one way to get the job done. You can go the traditional route, using hand tools to carefully measure, cut and chisel each joint. This method requires patience and precision, but after hours of repetitive work, it can start to feel a bit exhausting. On the other hand, you can use a router with the dovetail jig. This method speeds up the process significantly and can be just as effective. Setting up the jigs, fine-tuning the router, and making those precise cuts with the machine is a skill in its own right. It's not necessarily easier, just different. It requires its own kind of craftsmanship and attention to detail. At the end of the day, both methods lead to the same result: strong, beautiful dovetail joints that hold your project together. One isn't more valuable than the other, they're just 2 sides of woodworking. Whether you prefer the versatility of hand tools or the efficiency of power tools, each approach has its place in woodworking, and you should decide for yourself when to use which. As I mentioned earlier, the bottom box is a little taller, so it needs an extra dovetail to keep everything looking consistent. I'm holding off on routing the legs into the bottom box for now. If I shape the legs before the box is fully assembled, there's a risk that the dovetail at the bottom could break off. I'll wait until everything is glued up and secure, before cutting out the legs to avoid any damage. With the joinery all done, I can now route a rabbet into the bottom of the box. By setting up some stops along the router fence, I can make sure to keep the rabbet on the inside. Since the router bit can't cut square corners, I'm left with some curves at the end of the rabbet, which I will have to square up later. For the bottom box, I'm routing out a groove, since the bottom of the box will sit a lot higher to leave room for the legs. This went well, for the most part, but what I didn't know was that the bit was getting loose and slowly creeping out until finally, disaster struck and I routed a hole straight through the side. As much as this sucks, it's part of the process. I couldn't just replace the piece because the grain needs to match across the whole box. Also, I really didn't want to cut any more dovetails. Fortunately, since I'm staining the box black, I was able to fill the hole, and it's basically invisible now. Of course, I forgot to film myself fixing it. Mistakes like this can be frustrating, but they also teach you how to adapt and move forward. In the end, it's about finding solutions and making sure the final piece turns out as planned. I hate cleaning up glue on inside corners. In 100% of corners I have cleaned. I also took a massive gouge out with my chisel. That's a lie, it's probably more like 25%. But with 20 inside corners to clean, that's still 5 gouges. And since there are 5 boxes, that's 1 gouge per box, which makes it feel like 100%. To avoid this mess, I decided to tape the inside corners instead, so I don't have to deal with cleaning up glue later. Because I taped the inside, I also don't really have to care when applying the glue, and I can just liberally apply it with a large brush. To get it in between the individual dovetails, a small brush would be nice, but a piece of wood from the offcut bin will also do the trick. When gluing up boxes, you can check if they are square by measuring from corner to corner. If they are the same distance, you have a square box. If one side is longer and the other is shorter, by pushing the longer edges together, it also pushes the shorter edges apart, and eventually they will be the same length, again resulting in a square box. When gluing up dovetails, I also like to apply some clamps to each corner. This helps push the dovetails together and erase any small gaps in the joinery. Normally you would not glue the bottom of the box in, to allow for the wood to freely expand and contract. But because the router bit came loose, it routed the grooves way too deep, making the sides fragile. So fragile in fact, that one of them broke during this glue up. So to support the sides, I'm gluing the box and the bottom together. I'm not too worried about the expansion and contraction. Since the panel is veneered MDF, it won't move as much over the seasons. With the boxes glued up, I can now chisel out the corners left by the router bit. I know I was saying earlier how I was getting tired of cutting dovetails, but I do really enjoy a bit of hand tool work. It not only looks satisfying, but also feels satisfying. When cutting the panel for the lids, I can cut them slightly proud of the box. This will make the installation a lot easier, since I can sand away any misalignment after the fact. While you watch me mark and cut out the hinges, I want to thank you for making it this far into the video. I'm not new to woodworking, but I'm very new to filming myself do woodworking, and doing these voiceovers is a challenge all in its own right. I sometimes don't know what to say. Do I go into as much detail as I can, or do I trust my audience to understand what I'm doing, and instead talk about a more broad topic? So, if you have made it this far into the video, comment on what kind of voiceover you like, and I'll try to implement that in my future videos. It would also really help boost the video if you could give it a thumbs up. Also make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any further uploads. Okay, back to the woodworking. I could use a router to cut out the hinges, but with the box being so small, it's much easier to make a mistake with the router. A router can take off too much material in an instant, and before you know it, you've got a big problem on your hands. With hand tools, any mistake I make is usually smaller and easier to fix. The hinges I'm using have about a 3mm gap, which would allow the box lid not to close flush. To fix this, I'm inserting the hinges a bit deeper into the box. I'll be covering the exposed area later with a small piece of wood. When cutting dovetails, I always cut them just a little bit deeper than the thickness of the board. This way, when it comes to cleanup, I only have to sand down the ends of the dovetails instead of having to sand down the entire side. Normally I'd be using a belt sander for this, but mine just broke. So after some scrambling, I just grabbed my hand plane and got to work. When planing dovetails, make sure to only plane towards the inside, as you will tear out the end grain otherwise. After a bit of sanding, the dovetails look clean and the lid sits flush. Now I get to do one of my favorite things in woodworking: template routing. So I don't have to route over too much material and risk overwhelming my little router. I cut the excess off with the jigsaw, making sure to stay proud of the line. The closer I get to it, the easier the routing is, but the higher the risk becomes of cutting off too much. So you need to find that sweet spot. I really do enjoy template routing. It's easy, fast and satisfying. It's like copy and pasting. You just make the template and then with the templating bit you can copy the exact shape onto your workpiece. I'm really happy with how this leg detail turned out. It's exactly what I envisioned. These are the times I look forward to when woodworking, when everything goes just right. To finish off the lid, I'm putting a large chamfer on it. I wanted to make it even bigger, but if I had done that, the screws would have poked through the top, so this will have to do. With the boxes sanded, I can now put the bottoms in. I just use little nails to attach them. I could use a dab of glue, but nails are stronger than you might think. I mean, we use them to build houses, so I'm sure they'll be able to hold a couple sewing needles and some thread. Now we can finally work on the mechanism that will tie this whole project together. I'll try to explain this as simply as possible. First, stack all your boxes. Then divide the bottom box into 12 equal sections. Transfer the first line up to the other boxes, and from there transfer every second line. This will leave the top boxes divided into 4 sections, with the 2 center sections being the same size and the 2 end sections also being the same size. Next, mark the center of each line. For the top box, you'll mark the 2 lines towards the inside. For the middle box, you'll mark all 3 lines, and for the bottom box, you'll mark the 2 lines towards the outside. The mechanism has 2 different sized stretches. For the shorter one, measure diagonally from the top box to the middle box, and for the longer stretcher, measure diagonally from the top box through the middle box all the way to the bottom box. If everything is done right, the longer measurement should be exactly twice the shorter one. These 2 measurements will determine how far apart the holes in your stretchers need to be. When working with metal, always protect your eyes. To cut the brass, you can use an old saw blade, as long as you cut very slowly. Brass is about the hardest metal I would cut with my Mitre Saw. Anything harder and you'll need a special blade. To cut the stretchers to size, I add the width of the material to the measurement, which leaves me enough space to give them a nice rounded finish. I've seen these boxes made with wood before, but I wanted to add some contrast, so I'm using 15mm wide and 2mm thick brass bars. To make my life a little bit easier, I'm cutting the corners off of the stretchers, so I don't have to remove as much material for the round over. Again, for this I wanted to use my belt sander, but as it was still very much broken, I'm resorting to a 3-step finishing process. First, roughing out the round over using an angle grinder with a diamond disc, then using a fine file, and finally some 400 grit sandpaper. This left a finish that I was pretty happy with. Now I can drill the holes the exact distance we measured earlier. I'm making these holes slightly bigger than the screws I'm going to use, to give the parts a little bit of wiggle room to account for any error. As I said earlier, the long stretchers should be exactly double the length of the short ones, so I'm using the short stretchers I just drilled to mark out the hole positions on the long ones. With the holes all drilled, I can now countersink them to allow the screws to sit flush. I'm pre-drilling all the holes, not only to make sure everything aligns properly, but also because these screws are made of brass, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a softer metal. When I was attaching the hinges to the box, I actually twisted off the heads of a few screws, so now I'm being extra careful to avoid making that mistake again. I'm putting a little nylon spacer between the stretcher and box to give the stretcher a little clearance and prevent it from scratching the box if there's ever any dirt in between them. I really love the way this mechanism comes together and how beautiful the brass contrasts the oak. Now, with the mechanism figured out, I can do some finishing work. I'm gluing in the little wooden pieces to hide the inside hinges, and then trimming them flush with my chisel. I'm putting a little 2mm bevel on all the boxes to hide any misalignment of the box, as this is not the most rigid mechanism. Before I apply the finish to the box, I want to add a bit more contrast by staining the bottom box black. To prevent the grain from raising and leaving a rough finish when I apply the stain, which I wouldn't be able to sand afterwards, I'm pre-raising the grain with some water. Once it's dry, I'll use some sharp 180 grit sandpaper to smooth it back down. The stain I'm using is homemade, and it's really simple to make. It's just some steel wool that I left to dissolve in some white vinegar. The oxidized iron particles in the vinegar are going to react with the tannins in the white oak. And since white oak has a lot of tannins, it is going to ebonize the wood and give it a deep black color. Each wood species has a different amount of tannins in it, so this stain will give you a different result each time. The finish I'm using is the Fiddys Hardwax oil in Satin. I just apply it thinly with a brush, and then after some drying time, rub the excess off with a rag. Earlier I was talking about buying or making a sewing box, and how because I'm making it myself, I can put in some extra details. This made me think about how much a box like this would actually cost if I bought it in a store. According to Google, the average wage of a custom furniture maker in the UK is £16 and 67 pence an hour. It took me about 2 weeks to make this, so that's about 80 hours. Which comes out to £1,333 and 60 pence. If you now add the material cost and an extra 10% upcharge for profit, you come to a final price of £1,631 and 96 pence. But no store would have such a convoluted price, so let's round it up to £1,650. So if you think about it, instead of spending £150 on this box, I really saved £1,500 by making a box instead of buying one. I didn't just want to give her an empty box, so I'm loading it up with some sewing supplies. I'm also putting in some jewelry that she wanted me to get her. I told her I hadn't arrived yet and probably wouldn't be here in time for the event that she wanted it for. That was a lie, of course. I'm really happy with how this box turned out. It's not the most complicated build I've ever made, but I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever made. What I think doesn't really matter though. Let's see what she thinks.
It's so cute. Thank you. You did amazing! Why do you think I would like that? What the hell? Just the look, the color of this, like everything. I just think it's so cute. What the? I like doing this because I like watching this. Look at that, look at that, look at it go, look at it go, look at it go. It's so cute, man.
I think it's safe to say she liked it. And with that, thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.